3. Pearl Harbor Impact. On Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941, I was seated at my desk in Ma Brown's boarding house on 16th Street, just around the corner from Wisconsin Avenue in Milwaukee. My old Philco with its low-fidelity 4-inch speaker was turned down to filter in soft background music as I reviewed class notes. 2 years earlier, my former UCLA colleague, Ivan Baranovsky, had met me at the train station and escorted me to Ma Brown's. I could still remember my arrival, climbing the stairs, hearing the landlady's hearty laughter and loud jokes of some of her boarders, and wondering how I could study amid such noise and confusions. But the price was right, $50 a month, meals included. And Ma Brown's Irish warmth and mirth, her generous servings of meat and potatoes, created a home away from home that could not be matched anywhere else in Milwaukee. I was enjoying the comfort of my room that lazy Sunday morning, lulled by the quiet music on the radio. It must have been about noon. Suddenly, the music was interrupted. An excited voice was reading an urgent news bulletin. Pearl Harbor, bastion of the United States Navy in the Pacific, was under attack. Japanese planes were bombing the vast complex. The harbor, the adjacent airfields. I sat frozen at my desk, and as the meaning of the news became clear, as its implications gained hold on my mind, I thought the future was dark indeed. My Army commission just a week before. Half of my medical training had been completed. I had received my Army commission just a week before. Now the war I thought we would fight only in Europe had spread to the Pacific. For Americans of Japanese ancestry, it was a time of particular shock. I do not know if German Americans and Italian Americans felt the same horror as the nations of their parents were taken over by expansionist military regimes. My brother John, just ordained, was celebrating the Holy Communion at St. Mary's for a congregation made up almost entirely of Japanese immigrants and their children. A friend who heard the report on his radio rushed to the church with the news. My father, as president of the Southern California Japanese Church Federation, convinced the Christian ministers of the area within hours. They designed an elaborate support plan for their parishioners, support that would extend until the people were taken away to the relocation centers and camps. In many cases, the ministers accompanied their flocks into the camps, but I could not imagine that first day, the dire consequences that awaited my own family as the hysteria inspired by Pearl Harbor spread. I am sure I was thinking more of a short-term impact. How would my country recover from and respond to this devastating treachery? And in a very personal sense, how would this affect my complexion of my training as a physician? It was that very night that the FBI swept through uptown Los Angeles, arresting, among others, Aki's father, and it was then that the FBI began careful surveillance at the rectory at St. Mary's. Louise reported that my mother became expert at identifying the agents among the callers at the church and would quietly say to the other family members, "F's on" at the door. An FBI agent called on me at Ma Brown's as well. He had come to confirm my father's statement about my Army commission. I had said that I was not religious, despite the internal strength I gained growing up in a church family, but in those days I would walk down Wisconsin Avenue, the principal thoroughfare of Milwaukee, at the Jesuit Church, which was the chapel for the Marquette University, as well as the parish church. Perhaps it helped that I was not, however, able to overcome my doubts about the power of divine guidance, nor could I find the abiding faith that sustained my parents and my brother John. Reassuring words soon reached me from the Army. I would be permitted to continue my studies. My commission would not be withdrawn, and my coursework would be accelerated so that I could receive my medical degree 3 months ahead of schedule, in February of 1943. The final 2 years of my training opened my eyes to the challenge of pediatrics and led me toward the specialized work. I would later undertake work that would take me to Nagasaki and the children of the bomb. This early training was concentrated at the Milwaukee General Hospital and Children's Hospital, just a block away from Ma Brown's. Our dean, Dr. Eben J. Carey, was dedicated to training the general practitioners, a policy that helped me greatly in subsequent years, both as a combat physician and when I worked among atomic bomb survivors. The training included a 6-month home delivery obstetrics in nearby Chicago on the South Side, a forlorn and troubled area served heroically by the Chicago Maternity Center. The crime and violence in the area forced the police to patrol in groups of three. Two student doctors were dispatched on each call. The wartime shortage of physicians and nurses made it possible to provide further support. We had specially equipped medical bags and the encouraging words of our mentors. Nothing more. I was relaxing after one of those deliveries, chatting with the family of the new arrival in the living room of their modest apartment, when there was a frantic cry from a woman who had been helping the young mother. "Doctor, doctor," she called. I ran into the bedroom just in time to receive a second baby. The parental examinations had failed to discover that she was carrying twins. I took no chances after that. My most discouraging experience came one night in a darkened building on a narrow side street. We rang the bell, and a minute later a sliding slot opened the door and a harsh voice called out, "What do you want?" I held up the obstetrics bag, and the door was open. It was a brothel. On a simple metal cot in the side room, a youngster, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, was ready for delivery. We delivered the baby, then the other students and I routinely reviewed emergency procedures for the new mother, gave telephone numbers to a woman in attendance, and promised that a nurse would be by for a checkup in a day or two. Despite the squalors, both mother and baby appeared well, but we knew the slim chances both had for a full and rewarding life. We both felt concerned for the whole child, not just its physical health, and for the family. It was a concern that grows in any practice of medicine, especially when the practice touches the lives of children. It was a concern that led me to specialize in pediatrics after I returned from the war in Europe. It was a concern that would accompany to Nagasaki. Graduation came a month after my obstetrics assignment in Chicago. It was an event toward which I had been building, training, and working for 20 years, but as matters developed, it was a lonely and isolated occasion, robbed of much of the sense of celebration, for no one in my family could be present. All of them but one brother were still incarcerated in the American concentration camps. Peter was a buck private in the Army. He had left law school immediately after Pearl Harbor to enlist. As a soldier of Japanese ancestry, he had been given the options of cleaning bedpans or washing dishes. He chose dishwashing in the officer's mess. It was not long, however, before he was commissioned. Later, after the war was won, he went to Japan as an intelligence officer. Just before graduation, I received a gift that was to change my life. It was a beautiful leather-covered clock from Abercrombie & Fitch in New York. There was no gift card, but I speculated. It must have come from a key, who by then had been released from the relocation camps to live with her sister in New York. Who else? I was wrong, as it turned out, but the unexpected consequences of my guess were wonderful. The clock was a gift that led to my marriage with a key. I learned many years later that it was from my brother John. He was in a relocation camp in Arizona pending a possible assignment as a military chaplain and had ordered it from the catalog. There were 3 weeks of vacation between graduation and my new assignment as an intern at City Hospital in St. Louis. First came the reluctant farewells to Ma Brown and those who had shared the warmth of her hospitality for those 4 years. It was then that I was able to visit my parents and Louise at Camp Jerome and see firsthand how thousands of West Coast Japanese and Japanese Americans had been treated. The awful conditions in which my family were imprisoned seemed distant and vague before the personal visit. I took the train from Chicago to an unscheduled stop in Arkansas. It was the middle of the night. I stepped down off the train in a glare of searchlights. An officer with a detachment of armed soldiers asked for my identification, then drove me in a jeep to nearby Camp Jerome, visible long before we arrived because of the bright lights and the guard towers. I was escorted through the gates into a barbed wire enclosure, but we did not proceed to the barracks. To my shock, we went instead to the camp hospital where my father was recovering from a massive beating. His swollen face and bruised body bore witness to the viciousness of the attack. He was grateful only his attackers removed his glasses before one pinned his arms behind him and the others pummeled his small and wiry frame. "Don't worry, James," he said immediately. "I am all right," eager to show me that his inquiries were not serious. He moved over the hospital bed and smiled weakly, but I could see the terrible pain that accompanied each movement. I was able to reassure my mother and sister the next morning that the injuries were not life-threatening and that, without major complications, Father would recover. At age 61 he was a most resilient patient. Perhaps I should not have been surprised by this brutal event. A few weeks earlier I had received word in a letter from friends that my father was in danger. After the beating he declined to identify his assailants. He understood, I am sure, that the attack was a measure of deep frustration felt by so many imprisoned in the relocation camps. My father's vigorous counsel to the young men that they would enlist in the army only increased the anger of some who had seen their military draft eligibility change from 1A to 4C, unfit for military service. Although American citizens, they have been dispossessed of their homes and incarcerated in what they understood to be a total deprivation of their constitutional rights. I stayed on in Camp Jerome for more than a week, occupying my father's bed in a small tar-peppered barracks room, eating with Mother and Louise in the mess hall, visiting old friends from the uptown Los Angeles as a visiting doctor. I was invited to give a lecture on poisonous snakes, one of the environmental hazards of the camp. It was the first time I had to put my undergraduate interest in herpetology to practical use. As soon as I arrived in St. Louis, I was assigned to the Contagious Disease Hospital, which was struggling to respond to an outbreak of a virulent form of meningitis. There I learned an important lesson about the limits of what a doctor can do, a lesson that returned me to when I met the physicians who served the survivors of Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs. However good our training, however the miraculous drugs we have, we cannot always prevent death. Our only effective response to meningitis was intravenous applications of a recently introduced drug, sulfa. We medicated ourselves as well in hope that the sulfa would also serve as a preventative. It was a grim work and exhausting, but most helpful in my education. Spinal taps became routine as we ministered to these critically ill patients. Two facts stood out to the Contagious Disease Hospital. All of the St. Louis patients were racially segregated except this one, and at this one, a great majority of nurses who volunteered for the tough work were African Americans. I learned a second important lesson at St. Louis. The efficacy of another new drug, the antibiotic penicillin. It was an extremely short supply back then, and cases were carefully screened before it was used and approved. I presented the case of one of my patients, a man with a life-threatening lung abscesses, and won approval. His response to the penicillin was dramatic. It saved his life. The case was carefully cataloged to become part of the accumulating data that would facilitate effective use of the drug. In a few months, when I found myself in combat, I would fully appreciate the importance of sulfa and penicillin. The interns at St. Louis learned yet another lesson while I was there, but it had nothing to do with medicine. After years of hardship, they had finally revolted against the parsimonious pay and endless hours. The city council responded with a pay raise to $50 a month, equivalent to the pay of an apprentice seaman in the Navy at the time. But the hospital administrator had his own response. He quickly raised our pay to the new standard, but began charging our room and board. Our take-home pay fell to below $25 a month. Only those lucky at informal gambling games found themselves with enough cash for a night on the town. One of my last visitors before I left St. Louis was Lieutenant K. Tanahashi, a classmate at UCLA. He had been an officer in the ROTC and UCLA, and had volunteered for his service while in relocation center at Austin, Arizona. He was off to join the 100th/442nd Regimental Combat Team of Japanese Americans bound for Europe. "We'll show them," he told me as he left. They did, and he did. A member of what President Truman was to call the most decorated unit in United States military history. But Kai was one of those who did not come home. When my father recovered from the injuries he received in the relocation center, he and my mother were allowed to leave, but not to return to Los Angeles. They found a small apartment in Chicago. My sister was able to go to college, and I was able to visit my parents in the apartment after finishing my internship. I had my first job as a doctor during that brief time. I worked in the induction center providing physical examinations for volunteers and draftees. Knowing my departure was imminent, my mother had been hurriedly knitted a hara-maki, a waistband worn by the soldiers of Japan that symbolized the umbilical tie of the warrior to his mother. I confessed I never felt like a warrior when I found myself in the heat of battle, but I cherished its symbol. I was with my parents in that Chicago apartment, far from my home in Los Angeles, when my active duty orders arrived. I was to proceed to Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, the site of the Medical Field Service School. Clearly, it would not be long before I headed overseas.